Um, Welcome you all to this year's John House lecture in Japanese studies. My name is Nam-lin Hur. I teach Japanese history in the Department of Asian Studies. I serve today as a moderator for this event today. This is me. Sorry. Our event today proceeds, as you see, like this. First, I would like to invite Professor Sharalyn Orbaugh, who is a department head of Asian Studies. She will make opening remarks.
Welcome. I'm delighted to be here. And as Namna just mentioned, I'm Sharalyn Orbaugh, and I'm the head of Asian Studies. And I would like to begin this event by acknowledging that Vancouver is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. For millennia, the Coast Salish peoples have lived and worked in this area. They have learned and passed down knowledge to younger generations, and we are privileged to be able to continue that work with them on their land. I'd like to say a few words about the John Howes lecture and about John Howes himself. In a moment, we will welcome this year's speaker, Professor Oleg Benesch, who is a PhD graduate of this department, by the way. I'm very pleased about that. But first, I'd like to tell you a bit about the lecture series and about John Howes. The Department of Asian Studies at UBC was founded in 1961, so more than 60 years ago, with John Howes as one of its founding members. Studies of Japanese intellectuals such as Uchimura Kanzo. His outstanding contributions to the study of Japan and Canada were so numerous and so impactful as to lead to his being awarded one of the very highest honors that the Japanese government bestows on foreign scholars, that is, the Order of the Rising Sun with Garter. But what I'd like to emphasize most this evening is Dr. Howes's generosity and engagement with his students, something that Dr. Roy Stars, a former student, describes like this. Quote, "At a time when academics are often criticized for being devoted too exclusively to research at the expense of students, Professor Howes set an example for us all. He gave generously of his time and energy to help students at all levels with every manner of problem, whether it was a first-year student struggling to understand the meaning of life, or a PhD student trying to puzzle out the best approach to his dissertation. For one and all, Professor Howes' door was always open. Since a large university can often seem a cold and impersonal place, it was a great comfort to us to be welcomed by a warm smile and a friendly word from this large and rather fatherly figure. He brought a refreshing taste of small college life to a large university setting," end quote. Accordingly, when Dr. Howes retired, his grateful former students and colleagues joined together with his family in creating this annual lecture series in his honor, and now, since his passing in 2017, in his memory. I'd like to express our deepest appreciation to his sons and other family members for their continuing support of the Department of Asian Studies through this important annual event. And now I will turn the floor back to Dr. Nam-lin Hur, who will announce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Would like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Benesch. Where is it? First of all, as Sharalyn said, Professor Benesch is a scholar whom UBC has produced. So welcome back, Oleg. Currently, Professor Benesch is a professor of East Asian history and head of the Department of History at the University of York in the UK. Professor Benesch is a leading scholar of Japanese samurai worldwide. He has authored the highly acclaimed book, Inventing the Way of the Samurai, Nationalism, Internationalism, and Bushido in Modern Japan. He also co-authored Civilizing Emotions in 2015, Japan's Castles in 2019, and Drugs and Politics of Consumption in Japan in 2023. He is a historian of nationalism, memory, identity, gender, nostalgia, and authenticity in the comparative context of Japanese, East Asian, and European history. In addition, he is an avid soccer player. I noticed that he also works on the history of soccer. Today, Professor Benesch will speak about the samurai knights and nationalisms of Japan and the medievalization of the modern world for about, I guess, 50 or so minutes. And then
No, thank you so much, to Professor Orbaugh and Professor Hur and the department for very kind invitation to give this talk, and thank you to everyone for coming along. I'm especially honored to be giving the House lecture. For the reasons that Professor Orbaugh mentioned, I had the good fortune that even though Professor Taus had retired by the time I arrived in 2004, he was still around at a lot of kind of events, and I had a lot of conversations with him, and his work was very influential on my own research. His work on Uchimura Kanzo, which you mentioned, also work on people like Nitobe Inazo, and he was just so incredibly generous with his time and expertise. I'm really thrilled to be back in this lovely city for the first time in about a decade. See a lot of familiar faces as well. And kind of on that note, kind of throughout the talk today, I'll be mentioning a couple things located in and around Vancouver and UBC, mainly buildings that are relevant to my talk today. And these are things that I did not really take notice of when I lived here, but as my research has evolved, I've kind of looked at them a bit more closely. So, I realized that I've kind of promised you samurai and knights in the title of my talk, but I'd actually like to start with a somewhat different group, which is the Boy Scouts. So the Boy Scouts are officially founded in 1907 by the British military officer Robert Baden-Powell, a veteran of the Second Boer War, who'd spent much of his career in India and Africa. And beginning with the Boy Scouts, in my talk today, I would like to examine how the celebration of the medieval past became a global phenomenon at the turn of the 20th century. In text of the Boy Scout, and has probably sold about 100 million copies in dozens of languages. Copies of the book immediately start circulating throughout the British Empire, and it's it is the foundational text for Scouts Canada when this is officially set up in 1914. Scouting for Boys, if people have read it, the Boy Scouts don't usually use it officially for the last couple of decades for various reasons. But it's filled with like outdoor skills and adventure stories, but it also has a very pronounced moral mission and a purpose that's closely tied to imperial aims, as the cover there kind of suggests. We see the Union Jack there. In the opening section on Scout's work, we find the following lines. The history of the empire has been made by British adventurers and explorers, the scouts of the nation, for hundreds of years up to the present time. The knights of King Arthur, Richard Coeur de Lion, and the Crusaders carried British chivalry into distant parts of the earth. Raleigh, Drake, and Captain John Smith, soldiers and sailors of Queen Elizabeth's time, faced unknown dangers of strange seas, as well as the known dangers of powerful enemies, to take and hold new lands for the expansion of our small kingdom. Now, chivalry and empire are two of the main themes in Scouting for Boys. And Baden-Powell drew a direct line from medieval knights to modern soldiers, gentlemen, and Boy Scouts. Many Victorians believed that the unrivaled strength of the British Empire had its origins in the medieval past. Soldiers and imperial administrators often saw themselves as crusading knights, bringing their ideals of civilization to the world. These drawings here by Baden-Powell are just some of his many sketches with medievalist themes. Related to the image on the right, Baden-Powell writes in Scouting for Boys, quote, just like St. George of old, the Boy Scouts of today fight against everything evil and unclean, end of quote. And so as we see in Baden-Powell's work, Victorian chivalric ideals were very much focused on national and imperial glory. However, of Britain, and their rules were very much the same as the Scout law which we have now. And very much like what the Japanese have too. We are their descendants, the knights, not the Japanese, and we ought to keep up their good name and follow in their steps. The Japanese have their bushido, or laws of the old samurai warriors, just as we have chivalry or rules of the knights of the Middle Ages. So Baden-Powell here is drawing comparisons between British chivalry and what he saw as the Japanese equivalent, which is bushido, the way of the samurai, or the way of the warrior. And I mean, today, bushido is not so well known outside of Japan, but it's still commonly found in films, kind of manga, anime, martial arts, and many other types of Japanese popular culture. But in 1908, I mean, bushido is a household word in Britain and much of the world. Anyone reading Scouting for Boys in 1908 would have immediately recognized bushido and its connection to the samurai. And in the following, I'm going to explore how we got to this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of first look at the concept of medievalism as it is traditionally understood in the context of Europe, and I'll briefly kind of touch on some aspects of its recent resurgence. I'll then discuss the impact of medievalism on Japan from the 19th century onward, and then I'll outline what I call the medievalization of the world and how this related to histories of medievalism in different regions, and how examining Japanese medievalism complicates our existing understandings of the European experience. Now, medievalism or medievalism studies is a major and long-established research field, with countless books and articles as well as dedicated academic journals. In this field, the term medievalism is typically used to refer to uses of the medieval past and medieval symbols after the end of the Middle Ages. And I should note that the Middle Ages in question here are usually European. I'll return to the concept of medievalism again a bit later, but just wanted to and also been the source of popular aesthetic, cultural, and spiritual ideals since at least the late 18th century. In the 19th century, this interest in an idealized medieval past grew rapidly with the proliferation of nationalist sentiment and the formation of new nation states. And just as a kind of picturesque and representative backdrop, I'm sure many of you will recognize Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, which was a medieval ruin before being rebuilt as a Gothic fantasy with modern plumbing by King Ludwig II in the late 19th century. Now, the medieval period seemingly provided a stable refuge in traditional ideals in a world that was quickly changing through industrialization, urbanization, and upheavals in political and religious life. Although the classical age of Greece and Rome retained a powerful cultural influence, many Europeans came to seek their distinctive national origins in the medieval period. These origins included language, culture, ethics, and religion, as well as national founding myths. And this chivalric revival that took place across Europe in the 19th century also considered the European or the medieval period as the origin of European nations' martial traditions, which drew heavily on certain battles or heroes. The celebration of an idealized medieval past was a trend across Europe. In Victorian Britain, this was exemplified by buildings such as the Palace of Westminster, where the Parliament is, built in the mid-19th century in a medievalist Gothic style. And out front, we have an 1850s statue of the aforementioned King Richard the Lionheart. This martial aspect of medievalism was important not only in kind of intra-European conflicts, but it's also at the heart of the imperialist push. I mean, as I mentioned before, we have colonial soldiers, we have colonial administrators drawing on an idealized martial and crusader past as they imposed Western ideals of Christianity and civilization upon colonized societies. And the same ideology was eagerly picked up in Europe's current and former settler colonies. One prominent example of this so far as blaming Scott for the war, for causing it. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but I mean, in 1888, Mark Twain satirizes the proliferation of medieval themes in his book, A Yankee at the Court of King Arthur. The medieval could also be seen in art and architecture, with countless universities being built in the collegiate Gothic, medievalist style reminiscent of Oxford and Cambridge, especially as we can see here at the University of Pennsylvania Fisher Library. Just down the road from us in Seattle, the Suzzallo Library is a Gothic fantasy, especially its reading room. Even closer to home, we can still find medievalist elements right here on the UBC campus, even if they have been partially incorporated into larger modern buildings, as in the case of the current Irving K. Barber Learning Center. Just a bit further down from the Barber Learning Center, the chemistry building D Wing is slightly more subtle in its collegiate Gothic style. Similarly, in cities across the United States, National Guard armories were built to resemble European castles, bringing together medieval symbolism with the modern military, as National Guardsmen in New York and other cities saw themselves as members of a noble elite. I mean, this is in New York City there, the Park Avenue Armory. Similarly, in Vancouver, the Beatty Street Drill Hall is one local example of this, combining Gothic turrets and parapets with two modern tanks parked out front. Around the world, Gothic architecture came to represent not only tradition, but also power and authority, as seen in countless prison designs that combined the modernity of the panopticon with medievalist elements, evident here in Strangeways Prison in Manchester. But these themes are not limited to Europe and Northern Europe and the Americas. I mean, this is the Central Prison in Lisbon, which is a very similar style. And medievalism, it goes beyond architecture, however. The popularity of the tales of King Arthur and the work St. George and the Dragon, which we saw in Baden-Powell Scouting for Boys, was used by all sides in the 1910s. We see here a British St. George and the Dragon and a Russian one on the right. Propaganda posters in the First World War portrayed the Americans as knights come to the rescue. We can kind of see the crusading knights silhouetted in the background behind the Americans. While some scholars contended that popular medievalism ended with the First World War and the chivalric revival died in the harsh reality of the trenches, others have shown that medievalism was prevalent throughout Europe until at least the Second World War. First World War memorials used chivalric imagery, and fascist governments in Italy and Germany rebuilt and made use of medieval castles, such as the Wewelsburg shown here, which was built by the Nazis atop medieval ruins to become an SS headquarters. As the above examples suggest, martial aspects were a key aspect of medievalism, and it was often related to war, empire, and commemoration. These martial aspects are the focus of my current research, but it's also important to note that medievalism was also used for more peaceful causes, such as the International Knights of Labor pushing for workers' rights, or the women's suffrage movement frequently invoking Joan of Arc. Now, in order to understand the complex development of Western medievalism, it's important to put it in a global perspective that accounts for its entangled histories with other medievalisms and ideologies. And it's in that context that I now want to shift to the other side of the world and look at the case of Japanese medievalism. And I'd like to start with a bit of a long quote from Basil Hall Chamberlain, who's an eminent Japanologist who spent several decades in Japan in the late 19th century. And he writes a famous book called Things Japanese in 1891, and he opens it with the following lines. To have lived through the transition stage of modern Japan makes a man feel preternaturally old. For here he is in modern times, with the air full of talk about Darwinism and phonographs and parliamentary institutions, and yet he can himself distinctly sleeps in nirvana. His modern successor, fairly fluent in English and dressed in a serviceable Western-style suit, might almost be a European. Old things pass away between a night and a morning. The Japanese boast that they have done in 20 years what it took Europe half as many centuries to accomplish. And I'd like to just focus on a couple lines here. I mean, Chamberlain stating that here he is in modern times, yet he can distinctly remember the Middle Ages. While the samurai swords and other relics of feudalism now sleep in nirvana, Japan has leapt from the medieval to the modern in only 20 years. And Chamberlain is writing in 1891, which is 2 decades after the Meiji Restoration or Meiji Revolution of 1868, that's typically portrayed as the beginning of modern Japan. And today, the history of Japan is typically broken down in this kind of periodization, with the Kamakura to kind of Sengoku periods treated as the Middle Ages. In Chamberlain's day, however, the Middle Ages extended all the way to 1868, when Japan embarked on a course of rapid modernization. The medieval also reflected European views of backwards Oriental cultures, and many people in Japan were also embarrassed by the supposed feudal past. In turn, the new government emphasized the feudal nature of the old to legitimize its authority and modernizing agenda. And here I'd like to briefly reconsider this concept of medievalism that I flagged up at the outset. While medievalism is usually seen as a phenomenon that takes place after the Middle Ages had ended, the Japanese case demonstrates how Europeans were medievalizing contemporary non-Western cultures by portraying them as being in an earlier stage of development. Furthermore, people in Japan were medievalizing themselves, criticizing traditional culture as feudal. So in other words, by taking medievalism beyond the West, we need to reconsider the concept and what Timothy Curran has called the medievalizing process. And in looking at the transition in understandings and the development of Japanese medievalism, I'd like to look at the we see some, you see them in popular culture from video games to animation, and they're very important tourist draws, such as in this promotional photo from Shimane Prefecture. Ignore the ninja on the left, you're not supposed to be able to see them anyway. But samurai and castles are now seen as ancient carriers of Japanese culture and symbols of enduring traditions. Along with Japanese swords, samurai and castles are martial symbols most strongly associated with the medieval period, and they continue to define popular views of Japan at home and abroad. In spite of their current prominence, both samurai and castles were widely rejected after 1868 as, quote, outdated feudal relics, as Japan looked towards new Western ideals of civilization and enlightenment, as we can see here in a description of modern women's hairstyles. By the 1890s, however, samurai and castles were being rediscovered in a very modern way as tools for the creation of a Japanese national identity supposedly grounded in ancient ideals. And it's significant to note that the founding of the modern Japanese nation state in 1868, if we want to place it then, took place at a similar time to that of Italy in 1861 and Germany in 1871. So this is really kind of a global process. As elsewhere, Japanese history was rediscovered and recast to create a modern national identity based on idealized medieval martial ideals. And so to provide a bit of background to this transition, for 250 years before the 1860s, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shoguns, the Tokugawa family, in an age known as the Great Peace. The Tokugawa order emerged in the early 17th century from decades of civil war in Japan's Warring States period, and social classes became fixed and hereditary, with the samurai warrior class at the top, living in so-called castle towns, from where they ruled the peasants in the countryside. The shogun's capital, Edo, the present-day Tokyo, was the largest castle town and possibly the largest samurai in a difficult, if privileged, position. Warriors in a period without war, the samurai were for all practical purposes administrators rather than fighters. The lack of military necessity made many samurai consider their roles in society and try to justify their elite status, but there was little consensus among them. This was complicated by the fact that there was considerable diversity within the samurai class, and many of them were unemployed or just scraping by. In addition, while there was a certain view that samurai were an elite, there was no way of the warrior or other widely accepted or coherent samurai ethic. Although the Tokugawa shoguns presided over a period of peace, the state was organized along military lines, with massive castles at the center of Japanese cities. These originated in the warfare in the second half of the 16th century and were certainly related to the spread of firearms from Europe, and some scholars have argued that castles were also a European import. I'm happy to take questions on that later. This year's Osaka Castle, I mean, and when people talk about these European connections, you recognize some elements like the moat down front, these giant walls. I mean, the keep in the middle is quite different from European ones. The skyscrapers in the central business district are a bit newer. But to retain its power, the Tokugawa shogunate tightly regulated the construction or alteration of castles by other lords. Like samurai and their swords, castles evolved little during the Tokugawa peace, and they were little more than symbols of power and authority to awe the local populace. Militarily, castles were largely obsolete by the 17th century, and many fell into disrepair. They burned down through lightning strikes or accidents, or they were destroyed by earthquakes or other phenomena common in Japan. The stability of the Tokugawa order was finally undermined in 1853, when an American fleet began the process of opening Japan. The inability of the samurai government to face the foreign threats ultimately led to its collapse in 1868, following a brief civil war. Civil War challenges this myth. I mean, while there were certainly a few isolated fierce battles, the vast majority of castles surrendered with little or no resistance, and the war was over quite quickly. I mean, especially if we compare it with, say, the US Civil War of the same decade. The bloodless surrender of Edo Castle, the shogun's castle, is representative of the conflict. The new government then placed the Meiji Emperor in power after over 700 years of samurai rule had rendered emperors little more than figureheads. In spite of being an ostensible return to tradition, the beginning of the Meiji period was defined by wholesale modernization and westernization processes that shook the whole country. And we can kind of see it in these two photographs that are taken a few months apart of the Meiji Emperor, on the left in kind of very traditional garments, and then on the right, the European kind of military uniform. And that image on the right is essentially how he's generally depicted from that point onward. Japanese students and experts were sent to the West to study, while foreign advisors were brought in on an unparalleled scale. The Meiji government quickly established a modern army consisting of conscripts rather than samurai, and many of the samurai struggled to adapt to the new order. As many samurai feared, the abolition of the old warrior government was followed by the elimination of samurai stipends and their special status including the privilege of wearing swords. Their discontent was a major factor in a number of disturbances that shook Japan. The most famous of these occurred in 1877, when a large number of samurai gathered around the restoration hero Saigo Takamori and instigated a rebellion that the new government could only put down with great loss of life. This is actually the rebellion that's been fictionalized in The Last Samurai, in case anyone has seen that, which is phenomenally successful by bringing together medievalism and Orientalism and Tom Cruise. But the violence of the real failed rebellion demonstrated the gap that had developed between mainstream society and the former samurai who had been left behind. On medieval age. Castles suffered a similar fate in the early Meiji period. After centuries of neglect, there are almost 60 surviving castle keeps in Japan in 1868. Like samurai, castles were widely viewed as unpleasant and embarrassing reminders of the feudal past. Both regional authorities and the central government were eager to get rid of these obsolete castles and saw this as an opportunity to finally tear them down. The largest and strategically most important castles were given over to the new imperial army, but the vast majority were given to the finance ministry for disposal. These three castles here, these are all photographs taken before these structures were destroyed. None of these exist anymore. The bottom left, Kumamoto Castle, now exists as a concrete reconstruction. Castles were typically taken apart for their materials or to build schools, administrative buildings, or other more useful structures in their place. Wherever possible, the salvage rights to these structures were sold to make money. Here at Nihonmatsu in northeastern Japan, you can see the ramparts. All the castle buildings were torn down, and we have a modern kind of Western-style structure up there instead. Here in Shimane, this is the castle where we had the reenactor standing in front of it in the other photo. We can kind of see the castle in the top right. The castle keep is still up there, but they've torn down all the other buildings to make a Western-style prefectural office. Some of the larger keeps, including Matsue Castle, end up surviving mainly due to the expense and the danger of tearing these things down. One example of this is Himeji Castle. We can see the keep up here in the back left. All the outbuildings were torn down, and these are barracks for the Imperial Japanese Army that were put up instead of that. The plans for Himeji Castle are actually to burn the thing down and then just salvage the metal from the ashes because the metal is valuable. But then they decided it was just too dangerous because it would be such a massive fire. It's a good thing they didn't because, in the 1990s, it becomes one of Japan's first UNESCO World and they were also influenced by the medievalist ideals that they had absorbed at home. At the same time, the many Japanese delegations and officials who traveled to Europe visited castles wherever they went. The famous Iwakura mission, a high-level government delegation that traveled to the West in 1871 to 73, visited dozens of castles across Europe. These are some of the places in the kind of official record: Edinburgh Castle, Warwick Castle, Kenilworth Castle, Peckforton Castle, Castle Sant'Angelo in Rome, and then outside of Copenhagen, Kronborg Castle. These are just a few of the dozens of castles that they mention. The delegates on this mission also encountered modern Gothic architecture, such as the Smithsonian Museum Castle in Washington, D.C., which was completed in the 1850s. Many Japanese accounts mention the Tower of London. Kume Kunitake, the official chronicler of the Iwakura mission, admired the tower's armory with, quote, "a huge array of old armor and weapons, each item labeled with its date. There was a breech-loading gun made 300 years ago, which was a great rarity." However, Kume was decidedly less impressed by, quote, "a set of Japanese armor said to have been sent from Japan as a gift to King James I. There was also a collection of Japanese swords, but they were inferior pieces of the kind found in any antique shop and not worth looking at." End of quote. So Kume and other Japanese visitors were fascinated by the idea of turning an obsolete castle into a military museum for exhibiting the nation's historic weapons and accounts of great victories. This was seen as a useful tool to promote nationalism and a martial spirit, and the derelict Nagoya Castle was saved from demolition and preserved with the aim of converting it into a Japanese equivalent of the Tower of London, but with better swords, obviously. Societies the world over had long collected valuable, beautiful, and famous weapons, and Japan is no exception, with various warlords in collecting armor, swords, but also, commissioning expensive, decorative pieces. Citizens about the great martial deeds of the past. And in this context, the most important sites are perhaps the arsenals and military museums of Europe, and this includes the Tower of London. The Iwakura mission visited countless arsenals and museums, including the Great Military Museum of Vienna, which was only opened to the public in 1872, right as the mission is visiting. If military museums weren't in actual historic castles, like the Tower of London, they were often built to resemble them, as is the case of what is now the Heeresgeschichtliches Museum in Vienna. When the mission returned to Japan, its leaders sought to implement many of the things they had deemed useful in the West, including a national military museum, which they built in Tokyo in 1881 in the style of a European castle designed by an Italian architect. This building was called the Yushukan, and the military museum it housed remains one of the most famous and controversial sites in Japan, located on the grounds of the Yasukuni Shrine to the War Dead. The current Yushukan building looks quite different, as the original building collapsed in the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake and was replaced by a concrete structure in a more kind of Japanese architectural style. Can't imagine in the 1930s building a European castle on the grounds of Yasukuni Shrine. On the whole, throughout the 1870s and 1880s, many elite Japanese continued to reject their own feudal heritage. And this must also be seen in light of the dominant social Darwinist ideals of the time. Just as the Western powers had moved beyond the feudal age of development to reach the highest stage of civilization, Japan sought to make the same progress, just much more rapidly. However, the boom of medievalism in Europe, especially Britain, complicated Japanese views. On the one hand, the British Empire was the world's most powerful empire built on the most modern technology. On the other hand, the British were fascinated by medieval culture and traced their own rise to medieval ideals. Above all, the 1880s, Japanese attitudes towards the past had begun to shift. Part of this is generational, as memories of the Tokugawa period had dulled in the previous 20 years, and most Japanese no longer had meaningful memories of the samurai order of the samurai. At the same time, Western fascination with all things Japanese extended to samurai swords and armor, which were purchased in large quantities by collectors. European travelers, such as Prince Henry, the Count of Bardi, purchased tens of thousands of objects during a visit to Japan in the late 1880s, which has become the core of the Oriental Museum in Venice. And he also had himself painted in samurai armor and garments while he was visiting. Also in Italy, around the same time in Florence, though, the Anglo-Italian businessman Frederick Stibbert added almost 100 samurai armors to his vast collection of medieval European weapons, and these are now displayed in one of the medievalist great halls he built for this purpose. For anyone interested, I highly recommend, if you're in Florence, to visit the Stibbert Museum. It's about a 20-minute walk from the center of Florence. Most people don't go to Florence for the samurai armors, but you really should. If only to see the octopus helmet. That might be my favorite samurai object anywhere in the world. But I digress. Now, all of these dynamics made possible a symbolic rehabilitation of the samurai and other feudal symbols, inspired by developments throughout the Western world. One of the key figures in these developments was a Japanese traveler by the name of Ozaki Yukio. Ozaki is often called the god of constitutional government in Japan by his admirers. He served in the Japanese parliament for over 60 years, as well as several high government offices. For example, he was the mayor of Tokyo who gifted Washington, D.C. its famous cherry trees. But all of this comes much later, and for us here today, it's actually Ozaki's early life, when he didn't have quite such a fancy uniform, that's more significant. When he's young, he studies at what's now Keio University. He later holds successive positions as a newspaper and moralistic texts that he read in his education, which were filled with ideas of chivalry and gentlemanship. And these idealistic works gave Ozaki a very positive impression of England, and he finally had an opportunity to visit in 1888 when he was exiled from Tokyo for 3 years for political activism. Having traveled through the US and taken a ship to Liverpool, Ozaki claimed to have been immediately impressed with the politeness and character of the English people. Ozaki took a room in a fairly simple boarding house in London, observing that the standard of living was much lower than he had experienced in the US, but nonetheless, he considered England much superior to America, and he spent a great deal of time strolling around London and speaking about English culture with his landlady. His accounts actually sound a lot like those of Japanese exchange students in the UK today, although he was more interested in boat racing than soccer. And on the subject of boat racing, here's a painting of the River Thames in the 1880s when Ozaki was there. I'd like to just briefly mention one anecdote that Ozaki recounted on a number of occasions, and it's quite important to him. And there's one day in the spring where it's very busy. It's the one beautiful day in the UK that year, and he decides to go for a boat ride down the Thames. So he approaches the captain of a ship to kind of take him on. But before he can board, the captain of another ship comes on and tries to get Ozaki to go with him to essentially poach the fare. The first captain is quite angry about this, and the two captains start arguing as Ozaki's looking on. And the two, after they argue for a little while, they square up. It seems that both of them think their honor has been insulted, and they start swinging. It ends when the first captain punches the second captain in the nose, and he goes down in what Ozaki describes as a rain of blood. Now, something really interesting happens from Ozaki's perspective, which is that the first captain then helps the second captain back up, and they go for another round. Same result, the second captain goes down in a bloody heap yet again. Now, once again, the first captain helps him up again, asks him if he's had enough. He says, yes, I've had enough. Ozaki, this is really important. And I mean, there's quite a few different versions he retells. One of them, they're fighting with oars. But in any case, it's really important to him because it really summarizes what he sees as English gentlemanship. I mean, first of all, he's impressed that these aren't just some ruffians in a back alley. I mean, he sees plenty of that as well. But ship's captains, who they place so much importance on their honor that they're risking their health and safety. Ozaki thinks that in Japan, something like poaching a fare, something so minor, people would just ignore that. And he thinks that's just excessive passivity on the part of people in Japan. He's also very impressed by the spirit of fair play that he saw in this fight, with the first captain repeatedly helping the second captain up for another round. In Japan, Ozaki says, when a person had been knocked down, they would be kicked and beaten even more savagely than before, and you're certainly not going to help them back up. Now, the other thing is Ozaki, he really sees all of the fights he sees in England. There are quite a few. I've been living in England for about 13 years, and I've seen my share. But reading his accounts, it seems as though everything he thinks that these are really signs of kind of a vigorous and virile civilization. And when we're reading his accounts, I mean, you really get the sense that everything he saw and experienced in England just confirms his high opinion of English gentlemen and gentlemanship. And Ozaki's avid interest in Victorian moral tomes kind of really predisposes him to this positive view of England, and anything he encountered just kind of strengthened these convictions. But Ozaki is not just kind of a political exile and solo traveler, but he's also sending regular dispatches back to one of Japan's largest newspapers. And it's in one of these dispatches in 1888 that Ozaki first discusses the concept of Bushido, the way of the samurai. And in this 1888 article, which is titled Shinshi, or Gentleman, Ozaki extolled the virtues of English gentlemen and compared them with the men who called themselves gentlemen in Japan. And he says a Japanese gentleman is generally taken to be someone with a lot of money and a luxurious lifestyle. gold watches, top hats. Unfortunately, he doesn't go on to list those because that would have been interesting. But he does say, we can see that Japanese gentlemen are worlds apart from the English gentleman. How does a person come to be called a gentleman in England? Not by his fortune, but by his deeds and actions. Not by his appearance, but by his heart and intentions. If these are gentle and pure and good, then one will be called gentleman, even if one is poor. So, according to Ozaki, gentlemen were the key to the strength of the British Empire, as English merchants were the most honest in the world, making everyone want to trade with them. In contrast, Japanese merchants were not respected and would never reach great heights unless they changed their ethics. Ozaki believed that Japan needed gentlemanship in order to succeed, and probably even just in order to survive. Ozaki argued that the best translation for gentleman might actually be bushi, or warrior. He cited the Victorian view that traced gentlemanship back to medieval chivalry, and his journeys took place at one of the high points of the medievalization of the world. Inspired by these dynamics, Ozaki proposed that, like England, Japan had also had a feudal knighthood, the samurai, which could serve as a reference for a native gentlemanship. Ozaki called this ethic the way of the samurai, or bushido, which at the time bushido was an incredibly obscure term when Ozaki picked it up, but it soon came to be a household word in Japan and abroad. Ozaki continued to write about bushido upon his return to Japan, and his writings became more assertive. In an 1891 article he wrote, which is now titled Bushido, he writes, "If Japan desires to create a civilizational heaven, we should not discard Bushido even for a day. In England they are called gentlemen, here they are called bushi. Although the terms are different, they are ultimately the same. In English, gentlemanly and ungentlemanly are two words that determine the failure or success of a man. In our country, being labeled with the word bushi should have the same force." So here, while Ozaki is still holding the English gentleman up as the best role model, he argued that the Japanese bushi were in no way inferior. Of the samurai that began in the late 1880s was directly inspired by the Victorian chivalric revival, as the education of Meiji Japanese relied heavily on the many British and American world history textbooks that were translated from English into Japanese, and in which the Middle Ages and chivalry played an important role. Like Ozaki, many Japanese writers were heavily influenced by idealized notions of English gentlemanship as the basis for the strength of the British Empire, and they typically accepted the links that were made between medieval knights and modern gentlemen. These dynamics contributed to Bushido becoming a household word in Japan and abroad by the turn of the 20th century. Bushido was portrayed as an ethic of honesty, integrity, and frugality, similar to the values of an idealized English gentleman. This was part of a process by which Japanese rediscovered their own medieval past as a source for modern national identity. The wholesale demolition of castles stopped, and the first moves towards their preservation were initiated, even as dozens more castles were converted to modern army bases. Through castles and Bushido, medievalist symbols were linked to the modern state, especially the modern military that was seen as the heirs of the samurai warriors. This connection developed rapidly after victory in the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. It also changed significantly at this time. As an ethic based on samurai warriors, the martial elements of Bushido were brought to the fore after the war, as the new Bushido focused on self-sacrifice, patriotism, and love for the emperor. Bushido became a key pillar of the emperor-centered state ideology during and after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, a role that it would fulfill until the end of the Second World War. And in spite of Bushido's origins in Victorian ideals, the new chauvinistic Bushido interpretations rejected the notion of Western influence, with one prominent promoter of Bushido dismissing European chivalry as mere woman worship. I'm happy to say a little bit more about this at the end, but I'd just like to highlight there's been an excellent research and chivalry Japanese castles became the objects of a cultural discourse that posited them as a uniquely Japanese development and vastly superior to their European counterparts. So there's a real rejection of the idea that they were imports from Europe. Samurai and castles are some of the most tangible examples of Japanese medievalism, but they are also part of a much larger discourse on the Japanese medieval period in art, historiography, and literary studies. By the early 20th century, the notion of a medieval Japan was widely accepted in Japan and abroad, even if the periodization and character of this period remained open to debate. And here, I don't want to obscure the fact that discussions of the medieval period and its legacy in Japan have been every bit as sophisticated and diverse as they are in Europe. As in the West, scholars of medieval Japan have examined this period to provide important insights about art, literature, emotions, gender, masculinity, politics, many other subjects, and they've been equally frustrated when these understandings have failed to impact some of the most recognizable and popular tropes. In the decades before 1945, however, medievalism played a major role in providing the imagery and ideology for much of the Japanese imperial project, especially with regard to the inculcation of martial values and nationalism. So, kind of to wrap up, the narrative I've discussed so far has focused largely on Japanese responses to European, especially Victorian medievalism. But this is only one part of the complex dynamics of what I call kind of medievalization of the world that lasted roughly from the mid-19th century until the Second World War. Certainly, the trend towards medievalism originated in Europe, and its spread was aided through imperialism, colonialism, and the spread of European technology, institutions, culture, and languages. But at the same time, this is not merely a story of an Asian response to Western ideas. During this period, medievalism was transmitted, transformed, and reinterpreted within and across national boundaries. There were multiple influences on the development of conscious process. While certain Japanese thinkers were consciously based their samurai ethic on Victorian ideals, others looked entirely to native Japanese sources. Japan's victory over China in 1895 rapidly changed British views towards Japan and the samurai. An overview of the war published in The Graphic stated that the strategy and fighting powers of the Japanese have distinctly surprised Europe in the present campaign. Yet after all, the Japanese are a martial race by heredity and training. In ancient days, the feudal system developed regular military service, and in modern times, the old samurai spirit is only hidden under apparent civilization. The samurai came to be seen as a positive heritage of medieval Japan, and British commentators increasingly invoked them to explain various aspects of Japanese politics, culture, and society. By the turn of the century, British observers even held the samurai spirit up as a potential model for British society. In his book, Feudal and Modern Japan, the Unitarian missionary Arthur May Knapp argued that the name of samurai is in Japan today the untarnished name, to its people the synonym of the same lofty virtues and heroic devotion which we associate with the truest knight of medieval romance. Furthermore, not only was the name untarnished, but also knightly virtue itself has escaped the degeneration which it has suffered in Europe and has remained to this day a stainless glory. He continues, our age of chivalry was of the briefest, its flowering lasting only 2 centuries, while the knightly past of Japan is coterminous with the history of the empire. So for Knapp and others, Japan has now become the medievalist model. Idealistic views of the samurai in Japan spread widely throughout British society following the signing of the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902, capturing the imaginations of social reformers. It's reflected in works such as H.G. Wells' novel A Modern Utopia, in which an idealized samurai class rule atop a model society. Many people were drawn world during and after Japan's defeat of Russia in 1905. We also see this in a major diplomatic mission in 1906, which makes the Meiji Emperor a member of the Order of the Garter. itself supposedly dating back to the Crusades. And it's in this context that we should see Robert Baden-Powell's celebration of the samurai and Bushido in his 1908 book, Scouting for Boys. Historians of the Victorian chivalric revival have argued that chivalry died in the trenches in the First World War when mechanized warfare and poison gas put paid to fantasies of knightly duels and the romance of battlefield. In Japan as well, popular interest in Bushido and the samurai saw a sharp decline around 1914, although they would experience a resurgence in the militaristic propaganda of the 1930s. Ultimately, the turn of the 20th century was a historical moment when people around the world drew heavily on medievalist ideals, and knights and samurai became global icons, and they retain some of that glory today. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? Yes.
Oh, I have a. Oh.
So I'm guessing that as a student here, you visited Nitobe Garden.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could place Nitobe within the context of your talk. They seem to have a lot in common with each other.
Yes, that's a very good question. And I did spend quite a bit of time in the Nitobe Garden. It's a wonderful garden. Nitobe is a very interesting figure. I mean, if people come across books on Japan, if you probably go to any bookstore in Vancouver today, that has a little Japan section, if they've got 5 books on Japan, Nitobe's Bushido, The Soul of Japan, is probably one of them. It's published in 1900. Best time though when it's published, Nitobe himself, he's born, I think, late 1850s, I believe, but he ends up already as a teenager being sent up to Hokkaido to an agricultural college. He is educated in English. He then goes to the United States. Most of his upbringing is in English. And with this book, what he's trying to do is essentially explain Japan to Americans, Westerners, but specifically Americans. To be brutally honest, he doesn't know all that much about Japan because his education is primarily Western, I mean, especially American. The book becomes a bestseller around the time of the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt supposedly buys 50 copies to give to all his friends and family. So Nitobe is incredibly influential abroad. Within Japan, however, the copies of his book that make it back are really harshly criticized by anyone who can read it. It doesn't get translated for 8 years. He himself resists the translation because he knows it's going to get panned. When it does get translated, it's a bit of a flop. And it's pretty much because by 1900, Nitobe he's drawing all these parallels with Europe because that's what he knows with the West. And so he says he's quoting Bismarck and the Bible and any other figure you can imagine Western side. And then he will always say, and Japan had the same thing. And it was due to Bushido. It's a very quick read, and I would recommend it. But the thing is that parallel of kind of holding up Western chivalry by 1900 is already quite unfashionable in Bushido discourse, which has become much more chauvinistic. And so Nitobe is not aware of what's going on in Japan, and he himself actually, until 20 years later, thinks that he invented the word Bushido because he wasn't even aware of it being used before that. And I would say what's interesting with Nitobe is he becomes famous in Japan for having published an overseas bestseller. That's what he's known for. And he has really high profile. Kind of also Canada. This obviously does not end well then, once tensions start ratcheting up late 1920s, early 1930s. He dies in Victoria on, what is kind of seen as by his detractors as a kind of propaganda tour after the Manchurian incident. But in fact, he kind of has to leave Japan because he's under so much pressure and attacks from the right. his Bushido essentially disappears until suddenly Nitobe Inozo pops up on the 5,000 yen note in 1984, and everyone is, who is this? They don't often really know how to read his name, even. It's quite an unusual name. And then suddenly, his Bushido, which is much more kind of internationalist, is much more suited to the kind of Japan of the 1980s, which is, democratic, closely allied with the US and in kind of in the Cold War. And suddenly we have Nitobe's book around everywhere. And then it also becomes very popular in Japan. But within Japan, no one was really reading Nitobe's Bushido before probably the 1980s. So it's a really interesting one because it's now what everyone picks up and asks about. But his role in this, in the Japanese case, is really peripheral. So, sorry, bit of a long answer. Oh, get it.
I'm wondering, because Meiji Japan, they kind of rejected Japan's like samurai past or medieval past. Where did they draw like the emperor's kind of traditional kind of right to rule from?
So that, yeah, I mean, you're getting at a very important point here, which is one of the challenges we have with kind of the samurai more generally, but especially with Bushido in the early 20th century. It becomes this very key thing in kind of the state ideology. But the problem, and there's this narrative that, oh yeah, loyalty was redirected from feudal lords to the emperor. I mean, that's not really how this works. You don't really see. The only figure that ever always gets held up then is this 14th century warlord Kusunoki Masashige, who, we have a huge statue of him now in front of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. He's on the banknotes, everything else. That whole narrative is also a little bit problematic, what his relationship was with the emperor at that time. But there is this tension that if you're going to use a samurai ethic as part of an imperial ideology, it does clash with kind of the emperor. So the two, they coexist, but there is this tension there because it just doesn't, you don't have it in the older sources, so you need to kind of make things up. So if that makes sense. So a lot of the things, if we look at like the Meiji Constitution and such, that's then drawing especially on German or Prussian ideals and other things. So there's a whole way of setting this up without actually really using the samurai, unless you pick and choose certain things later.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And you invited this question. So, I mean, I think it's something you must be interested in. I'm obsessed with Nogi Taisho, Nogi Maresuke, and his suicide in 1912, which was meant to be, as he kind of frames it himself in his Isho, I'm doing this because I lost the emperor's flag, all these years ago and blah, blah. So it's a very kind of Bushi thing that he's trying to bring to his own death. But his wife also commits suicide at the same time, and nobody knows what to do with that. And there is she didn't leave anything. It's clear he did not know she was going to do that. He talks about her going on and taking care of his legacy. Following that, Moriogai, the famous writer, immediately turns to historical fiction and writes about samurai families. And there are women involved in every story and kind of how they are living out their Bushido. And so I'm kind of curious, both in the way it's used in Japan and in the way samurai is understood in the West, do women have any place at all?
That's a very good question. There's a few different things here. Part of it is I feel I'm being set up a bit because Professor Orbaugh has written an excellent article on Nogi Taisho, and knows even more about this certainly than I do. But yeah, Nogi Maresuke, on essentially he's the hero of Port Arthur in the Sino-Japanese, Russo-Japanese wars. And then in 1912, when the Meiji Emperor dies, on the day of the emperor's funeral, Nogi and his wife Shizuko commit traditional suicide. I suppose exactly what happened is a little up for debate, I think. And this shocks everyone, and this is one of the things that contributes to the decline of Bushido in all of this. Is everyone is just what that is Bushido, that's barbaric, that's feudal, and so we don't want anything to do with that. Something similar happens with Mishima Yukio in 1970, but that's another thing. But Nogi Shizuko, yeah, she is then held up as this kind of the embodiment of the samurai wife in a sense, you know, following him in death and this loyalty. The term samurai, I think that's the gendering of the term is really interesting. So I'm currently working with a colleague at the British Museum on a big exhibition there, and you know the title we would like to use for it would be something like you know, samurai didn't exist and half of them were women. I don't think it'll end up with that, but I think the term samurai is a really interesting one and something I've been kind of going back through because it's not really used in Japanese in the same way, right? You know, we're talking about Bushido, not Samurai-do, right? Like it's Bushi is generally the most common word that's used. Samurai is something that I think I've gone through the National Diet Library now. They've digitized everything, and for the last 150 years to figure out term. And it's because I'm convinced that it's essentially because it's known around the world and it's seen as like a global standard and a global icon. And where we can kind of see this, I think, is that samurai now, when it's written in Japanese, is most often written in katakana, which is the alphabet used for foreign loan words. So there's a Chinese character for samurai, Japanese character. There's also, you can write it in hiragana, in the phonetic alphabet, but it's most often now written in that. And it's when you have international things that it's used, like the Japanese soccer team, the national men's soccer team, Samurai Blue, or the baseball team, Samurai Japan. You know, it is this kind of international thing and it's outward facing, then you use samurai. But historians of pre-modern Japan would rarely use the word samurai for anything. It's always bushi. And so I think when we're using the term samurai, there is this image of, yeah, an adult male samurai in armor. That's what people think. But I think that's then maybe different than if we're using the specific Japanese terms, which would be more for specific ranks, and they'd be different for different regions, and those would then include, I think, more of the actual kind of family that would be men and women and children. But I think that image of the samurai that has developed outside, when we say samurai, I mean, I think that's become a very specific and different thing. And I think in Japan as well, when people say samurai, that's kind of what they're often thinking of, is this kind of global standard of this, yeah, this figure with swords and armor and everything else. So yeah, I don't know if that gets to your
Hi, thank you. The word feudalism becomes quite negatively occupation period and subsequently people denying feudalism in Japan. Have you come across that? Do you have any views on it? And now, of course, we don't hear that, but people were, even when I was an exchange student in 1966, we'd hear KO students saying, "Oh no, we're trying to get rid of feudal ways." And I never knew really what that meant, but do you have any ideas as to what they were talking about?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there is I use the two somewhat interchangeably here, but there is a tension between feudalism and kind of the medieval. A lot of people use them interchangeably, and that's, you know, some of the quotes I have here are doing that, and people are talking about the Middle Ages, or they're talking about the medieval, people like Basil L. Chamberlain. And you do have people saying, oh yeah, the Middle Ages, medieval goes till 1868, but no one would say the Middle Ages go until 1945. But you do hear people, as you mentioned, saying, oh, the feudal structures or the feudal kind of goes on until like the US occupation, essentially. So there's a very clear kind of narrative there from certain people. And some saying, oh yeah, and then feudalism continues on after that in different guises. So I think that is used very widely. I think feudalism does tend to always be negative the way people are using it, whereas the Middle Ages can, or medieval is not necessarily negative. It can sometimes be, but it can also be positive. I mean, there can be positive things drawn from that. So there's some tension there. I'm based at University of York in the medieval city of York. In the UK, we have kind of one of the largest centers for medieval studies in the world, and it's wonderful talking to all my medievalist colleagues. I'm primarily on Europe, but places all around the world. But some of them, they refer to feudalism as the F word, because they don't feel that it actually contributes all that much useful to some of the discourses and things they're looking at. What exactly is feudalism? So it may be useful for some things, and certainly a lot of people use it for certain purposes, but yeah, it's a very difficult one. That's something I'm still wrestling with, the different uses of feudal versus medieval and how those relate to one another. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor, my question is actually deriving from the question I've actually asked you in the course a few days ago. Apologize for any overlapping. And I think today we actually see a parallel Japan, or two faces of Japan. The first one is actually in accordance to many Japanese friends I personally know around the campus. He actually have the manga images printed out and stick at all of his bedroom walls. And he was also watching the dancing idols and something sort of like that, the pacifist Japan. But also at the same time, we know the existence of the controversial Yasukuni Jinja in the very middle, right next to the royal palace. And also on the streets of Tokyo, we would occasionally see right-wing propaganda trucks to demonstrate massive images of the rising sun flag. So I would be particularly interested if Kant said that, do you find anything new or intriguing about the contemporary development and reinterpretations of the Bushido thoughts, especially since that many people like Yuki Mishima have incorporated?
Oh, well. No, that's a very good question. So and a lot of the concepts are, pretty much dismissed. Bushido also kind of falls out of favor, understandably. But what you then get in the 1950s is people saying, well, that imperial Bushido from the wartime especially, that's an aberration. And now we need to go back to the original, and we need to look at original samurai texts, and we need to figure out what the original Bushido was. The problem with that is, if Bushido, as I would argue, is invented around 1900, and I don't think it's there before, but if you have it in mind and you go back and look at earlier texts, you can construct something. So I think that's one of the issues. But so you have people who are writing on kind of earlier history, using these terms like Bushido, which might not be found in a lot of the documents they're using, but it kind of creates this image of there being something. So historians more recently are a lot more careful with that, but that is something that's certainly out there in popular history. So we have people looking at those older periods. As I mentioned in response to that earlier question about Nitobei Inazo, suddenly in the 1980s, Bushido is everywhere again with Nitobei Inazo. during kind of Japan's the bubble economy, especially during the economic miracle, because people feel that you need to find a cultural reason for Japan's economic success. It can't just be that, they have better economic policies or there has to be something else. And so that's when you get all these things about, the way of the warrior trader, the samurai marketing, and all of these things, like all these business texts around samurai things, and how Japanese corporations are set up like samurai households and all of those things. So that's another whole kind of idea of this. And as I mentioned, Nitobei's quite pacifistic internationalist Bushido really fits that period. What we have in the early 2000s, then, there's a lot of debate in Japan, in the parliament, in the national diet, around kind of reform of the fundamental education law and bringing kind of ethics education back in a different way. And Bushido features really prominently in that, because a lot of people think, well, this is what we need to get, from a Bushido as well. They're not really drawing on kind of 1930s things, but as you suggest, well, we do have that as well. There are a lot of texts. There are a lot of quite disturbing propaganda materials that are produced in the 1930s and 1940s on Bushido, which start getting reissued in the last 15 years without context. Just these small publishers, small right-wing publishers, are just putting these things out again, things that have been published in 1942. And it's like, you can just buy it. And if you don't know what it is, I mean, you're going to struggle to read it a little bit because it's Japanese from 1942, but it is, it's just out there again. So there are bits on the right that are using this. I think most of the stuff and most of the places you see Bushido, if it's in sport or other things, I think is probably fairly innocuous and stripped of a lot of these things. It's also, martial arts is a big area where you see a lot of this as well. But there's the thing with Bushido ultimately is, because it is this kind of modern invention, essentially, you can put anything you want into it, and you can't really disprove people's Bushido theories in that same way. So, and I think in that way, this flexibility of not having firm roots just allows it to kind of keep going. So I wouldn't be surprised if, we keep kind of seeing it in different forms from now on, and it's so many different forms. So yeah, and I mean, now there's a couple of the big bookstores in Tokyo which do have little, Bushido sections, essentially. Yeah, I did want to go up. There's I think it's a 13-volume collection from 1942 called the Bushido Zensho, like the complete Bushido, which the Asian library has a copy of. And I went upstairs to look at earlier, but I couldn't, all the shelves and everything have changed. But that is something that was reissued in, I think, 2009 or something. So, it's published in 1942, and then a small publisher just like puts it out again. And I didn't have, when I was a PhD student, I didn't have the $1,000 or whatever it was.
Hello, my name is Konstantin. I'm from the St. Regis School. So I made a little research about the samurais and their warrior way. So I found the information about the lordless warriors called ronins. Does they have another warrior way, or maybe like other habits or something like that? Because as I know, they were so poor.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, if we look at pre-modern samurai, or warriors, I mean, even what is a samurai is just such an open question. I mean, it's only really once we get into about 1600 that, this starts to actually properly get defined. And then there is a lot of movement in and out of the samurai class. And then you have people like Ronin, kind of these masterless samurai. There's just so much diversity between different times and different regions that, and some people might write something about ethics and what they think about it. And you might have some daimyo, some warlords who might even write something like rules for their houses. But that doesn't mean that anyone in the next town is paying attention to that. And so these things don't necessarily correspond to one another. So you might find a writing by a samurai, might even be a ronin, and you can read that, and it can be an interesting reflection of what that person was thinking. But that doesn't mean that what that person was thinking influenced anyone else necessarily, or what influence there was. And some of the most famous texts, I mean, people might know the Hagakure, the kind of hidden by leaves, it's translated as often. That's from the early 18th century. It's the first line of it is, the way of the warrior is found in death. It becomes very popular in the 1930s, 1940s. The military uses it. Again, it's early 18th century. It's not actually published until the early 20th. And we don't get a full version of it. Because Japan obviously has written so much and we find so many documents, we're going to keep finding more and more things, but we have to look at the individuals and the specific contexts in which they're writing. So yeah, it's a very good question.
Okay, so my name is Eric, also a representative from St. Regis Secondary. I perhaps have a simpler question on my own, but I'm quite interested in how did the image of samurai shape how other countries saw Japan? Not in the means of perspective from the medieval Europe, but more in the stereotypes created by them.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We've actually got a research project, quite a large research project. We're working on this at the moment. Professor Hurs is involved in it as well, looking at kind of views of samurai in especially early modern Korea, where there are very strong views of the samurai since the samurai invaded in the 1590s, devastating invasions of Korea. You can look at views of the samurai in early modern Europe. There's samurai delegations that kind of travel around 1600 that travel all the way to the Vatican. We get to the modern period. I talked mainly about British views of the samurai. We can look at German views, which are going to be very different. A lot of this has to do with geopolitics. Have some colleagues, or a colleague looks at kind of views of the samurai in India, for example, in the 1930s, where people are saying, well, it's actually activists who are looking at kind of reforming or abolishing the caste system, and they're saying, well, the samurai should be a model because the samurai abolished themselves. So we see that sort of thing. In the Soviet Union, there's a different take on the samurai, which sees them as kind of the oppressors of other Japanese. So it's not necessarily seen as a national thing. In Italy, again, it's a very different thing. So there's a lot of work there to be done. We're doing that at the moment, is what I would say. So it's really this your research or study project if you're interested.
I just have a question about the colonial period, because from my understanding, this is happening about the same time where Japan is colonizing Taiwan and South Korea. Do you think they used the wave of Bushido being like a more and more like popularized term to like bolster their colonial rhetoric? Because with like Taiwan, they had them portraying Taiwanese as like unclean and having like the whole bathhouse thing, and then in South Korea, like having that they eventually like developed that slur for South Koreans, which sort of portrayed them as being like uncivilized. So like, do you think they used Bushido as a way to like inflict their influence onto the colonial subjects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And again, Bushido is used in many different ways by different people. So some would argue that Bushido is, and actually here I'll use Nitobe Inazo. He's a great example of this, because when he's talking about Bushido, he's trying to say that people in Japan are the same as people in the West and put it on that level. But at the same time that he's saying that, he's saying that people in Japan are superior to those in the rest of Asia. And I mean, and so like people in China, Korea, India, Japanese are at a different level, and because of Bushido being a big part of that. So you have that sort of thing going on. And Nitobe himself is a colonial administrator. I mean, he's very involved in the colonial project, especially in Taiwan. It's interesting, though, because you have other people then who are saying, well, Bushido is just this ethic, and why can't anyone pick it up? And what you do have is, especially in Taiwan, or it's not Taiwan, but a lot of the people in the Republic of China, and especially the nationalist government, academies in the 1910s, 20s, even 30s, and they are at the time when all of this Bushido spiritual education is going on, and they take this stuff on board. So actually, then the Taiwanese leadership, even after 1949, you have people kind of channeling Bushido, or saying that, well, this is what Taiwan needs in order to kind of continue the struggle against the mainland. So there are a lot of people in Taiwan even after the war, and there's quite a famous book written by I think president of the Republic of China on which is very much kind of on Bushido and pro-Japanese more recently. You tend to have very different sentiments in Korea, but again, it's very diverse, and we have to look at the specific historical context with these things and how people are using it. So it's a very good question.
Thank you.
The uniquely global practice of
Mm.
internal projects everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, that's true. And I think something like Bushido is then used in various ways if it's useful to that project. I think that's where, I mean, I see kind of touch on this in the talk, but that I think to the colonial kind of imperial project, what is really useful is that kind of social Darwinist, social evolutionary idea that, societies go through this kind of process of evolution effectively from, barbaric through kind of semi-civilized and finally to these ideals of civilization. And that's kind of essentially what the Western empires are selling in the late 19th century to, explain using what scientific methods to, explain British and European kind of superiority at that time. It's also attractive to say to certain groups, and so you can see why different groups are buying into that. So yeah, and that idea, as I mentioned, that if that these empires will then often say, well, we're at this level of civilization, whereas this group here are still in the medieval period. They're still in this feudal society, and therefore we need to, kind of look over them and bring them up.
I'm quite convinced by the medievalization argument you make, and I'm curious, are there any other time periods or ization processes you have in mind when you're thinking through the medievalization? Are there other layers and some kind of palimpsest that you would bring to our attention?
Oof, yeah, that's a very good question. I think probably the big counterpart would be the classical, kind of Greece and Rome, which coexists with medievalism, certainly in the Western context. You'll often see like prisons are, as I showed, kind of these Gothic structures, but then the law court is like kind of Roman kind of pillars and things like that. And so, and often on university campuses are really interesting because you will see the collegiate Gothic, but then you'll also see kind of like classical kind of Roman architecture as well. So I think those are really interesting. What function the classical and the medieval are doing, and I mean that's obviously coming from the European context, but that's then also sometimes imposed on places like Japan, where people talk about Heian Japan as being classical or something, and again trying to fit these same models into that. What I would probably stress rather than, and I think we'd have to look at specific societies, but I probably would stress, and I think this is why Japan is so interesting and useful when we're considering medievalism kind of in the European context, is that for whatever is why does it work in Japan? Because it doesn't work everywhere. And I mean, in the book I'm currently writing, it's focused on Japan in like this global context. We're not quite sure what that is. When is that? Is that a thing? There are various times where people propose medieval China or medieval India for very specific reasons, but it doesn't take in the same way that medieval Japan does. And so that's the question: is what role does the medieval play, and why does it work in Japan, but why does it not work in, say, India or China? And I guess the question then would be, well, what is working instead of that? And I think, but those aren't the areas that I work on. So I'm intrigued to see what people who work on those regions would find. Yeah.
Well, with the Meiji Restoration, the samurai of Bushi were forgotten and even abandoned for a couple of decades. And then later, the people encountered Europe and the West, and then samurai legacies were picked up here and there and reassembled. Eventually, along the way, the idea of Bushido was reinvented in a step. And then after that, Ozaki and Mitominajo, and then along the way, there were a bunch of people who really pushed hard for Bushido and promoted the Bushido into the 20th century, all the way to 1945. So as a result, the people who promoted Bushido eventually ended up driving Japanese soldiers or young people to sacrifice themselves in the war in the name of Bushido and medieval ideas. And so, but those promoters were intellectuals and scholars. I'm wondering, looking at those processes, eventually they say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." Hooked up. Who regretted what they had done in their life. Because in other areas there were people who eventually later, "I'm so sorry, I made a terrible mistake."
I wish that were the case. I think the biggest promoters of Bushido, one of whom is this Tokyo Imperial University professor called Inoue Tetsujiro, who is the editor of this complete Bushido that I was trying to find earlier, this 13-volume set, who dies in 1944. I mean, he's close to 90 years old by that point. So, and I don't think he would have expressed apologies or regret. There's a few others who then after the war actually lay low for a little while and then come back and keep saying more or less the same thing. They might change a little bit. I haven't seen anyone kind of apologize for it. I think Nitobe has some regrets around it. It's certainly like, he gets fame through it. And it kind of makes him and makes his career. But I think there is some regret about it as well. That he thinks it's maybe gone a bit too far. But one thing I would say is when we're talking about especially propaganda in the 1930s and 1940s, there is a lot of it and people are talking about a lot of it. But I would also say we don't want to read too much into it, because even though we can see the propaganda and we can really look at, as historians, we can look at the construction of propaganda. We can see what people have written, the films they've made, but we don't know what people thought about it when they're reading it. We don't know how closely they read it or what they were thinking when they watched the film. And actually, I don't think most people in Japan really bought most of this stuff. And if we look at what happens at the end of the Second World War, the Americans are sitting here during the Second World War, and the Americans are definitely buying it. They're thinking the Japanese are all these kind of Bushido-driven robots and will never surrender. At the end of move on. And I mean, he makes the point that I think more Germans actually committed suicide at the end of the Second World War than people in Japan, which I think is quite a key, kind of a key thing there. So the extent to which people are actually believing it, I think, is one of the issues. I mean, one thing that's really interesting, I think, and I've started working on a bit more, is there's this there's quite a famous series of propaganda films made in the 1940s. I think it's the Why We Fight series, and there's one, Know Your Enemy Japan. There's Know Your Enemy Germany and Know Your Enemy Japan, and they're directed by Frank Capra, who's like the top Hollywood film director at that time. Like, I mean, the production value and everything, these things are absolutely amazing. They're free on YouTube. I would look at them on YouTube. You know, Know Your Enemy Japan's about an hour long. But one of the things that Capra does in this is he essentially takes Japanese propaganda films and then just puts those together. And he says, well, look, the Japanese worship the emperor. They're self-sacrificing. They're militaristic. They all want to fight. You know, they're never going to surrender, because that's what it says in their propaganda films. That doesn't actually say what the Japanese people are like. It says what the Japanese government thinks the Japanese people should be like. Right. And so the message just overlaps. But what's interesting about that series, and especially Know Your Enemy Japan, is there's a lot in there on the samurai, but that's not generally taken from propaganda films. A lot of that is just coming from Japanese samurai films, like just popular films, like historical films. But I think the American expectation is that there has to be a bunch of samurai stuff, and so you put it all in there. But I don't think, if you actually look at Japanese propaganda, that there is that much of that samurai stuff in there, because I mean, people are interested in samurai popular culture, but it's not really as useful. So I think that's one of the things that's really difficult for historians, to get to that reception history and how people are thinking of things, unless they actually read something and write, this is what I thought about this propaganda film I just watched, which I mean, now we do museum questionnaires and
Milada Honcharenko, and I'm also a St. Regis student, as you can see by the shirt. I'm really happy to be here, and I apologize if I may say some things incorrectly or I understand something wrong. So as I understand from what you said, the Japanese people were kind of putting back the old-fashioned or just the traditional ways, like the castles were brought down, the places were replaced, and Japanese people were considering this as a relic. They just put it back a little bit. And right now, especially in modern time, I hear that Japanese people want to restrict some areas that kind of preserved this traditional look from clothing from the foreigners to preserve this traditional look. And I'm just wondering, can this look of Japanese people and samurais and Bushido really affect Japanese people that much that they want to bring back? Because I know it's not exactly this modern time that people want to bring back the old ways. It's been before that, I know that. But also why the people want to close down these areas, and why modern Japanese people think about their culture in such way. It changed, and I just want to know why.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, I think those are common sentiments in so many different cultures and societies, and the same kind of political issues that we see. I mean, one of the things, you know, the book the PhD, and then the book that came out of that, where I was looking specifically at Bushido, I was looking at contemporary political debates and things around Bushido. And one of the things that was quite interesting is a lot of the people they're using. And so people are using these things as these ideas often as tools to kind of help promote other causes and things like that. So I think rather than anyone necessarily trying to get back to a certain like samurai period or anything like that, it's an idea that's seen as, oh, this is part of the traditional values, whatever that may be, to kind of bring Japan, or have Japan be what it used to be. And it's just this kind of imaginary of what they think Japan used to be. And I think that's what you see in the debates in the parliament in the early 2000s in Japan, where a lot of conservative politicians are saying we need to bring back this moral education because when we were children, that's what we had, and it was great, and there was no crime, and people behaved, and everything else. And there's this kind of myth, I think, and that's not just Japan, that's a lot of other places. There's a myth in Japan among a lot of people that, oh, there wasn't any crime in the 1930s or early 1940s, and there wasn't anything. And it's like, well, actually, we do have the crime statistics from that period, and crime rates were very high, but that's not how people are seeing these things. So in that sense, and I don't think these sentiments are any more widespread in Japan than they are anywhere else. I mean, some people will try to mobilize these things for political ends, but I think for the vast majority of people, I don't think it's necessarily that significant. Bushido and the samurai they're great for popular culture. They're great for films. They're great for manga, for anime. You get wonderful stories. I mean, I enjoy watching the popular culture that comes out of it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to kind of live in that. So.
Well, it's 7:45, 15 minutes over. So I would like to bring the event to a close today. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. And thank you for your participation. Thank you, Sharalyn. And Lisa, and then Stephanie, just for your help. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah. No, I was wondering about the white shirts. Yeah.